My name is Niels from the University of Vienna, and this presentation is about a paper I've written together with Stephanie Collins entitled Interconnected Blameworthiness. So it is commonplace to view groups as blameworthy. Corporations are blameworthy for disasters caused by reckless company cultures, rioting mobs are blameworthy for property damage, and humanity is blameworthy for global warming. Often group blameworthiness has implications for members. Individual CEOs, rioters, and humans in general are blameworthy for their roles in group harms. In this paper, we conceptualize the factors that influence members' blameworthiness over wrongful group outcomes. And we focus particularly on the role circumstantial luck plays. We ask how to apportion distributed and shared blameworthiness, where distributed blameworthiness attaches to members of structured groups and shared blameworthiness attaches to members of unstructured groups. In the paper, we set out 3 allocative principles about how to distribute blameworthiness and argue that the interconnectedness of the group determines which principle applies. Now, all these principles concern the scope of blameworthiness, meaning what it is that you are responsible for. And following Michael Zimmerman, we distinguish scope from degree, that is, how much you are blameworthy for whatever it is that you are blameworthy for. We analyze 3 factors of interconnectedness within a group that we think affect the agent's scopes. Now, some of our discussion will concern circumstantial luck, which concerns the circumstances in which an agent makes decisions and acts, and also resultant luck, which is luck that concerns the consequences of an agent's choice. One might think that an agent's degree of blameworthiness should be unaffected by luck, as Zimmerman argues, even if the scope will be affected by luck. But we will show that, at least in some cases, it's possible that luck affects one's degree of blameworthiness in group harm cases, but only indirectly and unproblematically, as we will explain. So let's get to the allocative principles. In the literature, typically some various proposals have been given, but usually they only mention one type of principle, and that's meant to be a catch-all solution. And we aim to present a more nuanced account that harmonizes, in a sense, these different allocative principles. So let's start with the first one, the portion principle. Each agent is blameworthy for a different portion of what the group is blameworthy for, with no overlap between the agent's portions. Now, this is a pretty standard individualist kind of idea about how to distribute blameworthiness, where the agent is not even blameworthy for anything another agent has done. The second principle is the overlap principle. Here, each agent is blameworthy for a portion of what the group is blameworthy for, with some overlap between agents' portions. The idea is that I might be responsible not only for my own contribution, but also for the contribution of a fellow member. And finally, we have the full scope principle, where each agent is blameworthy for the totality of what the group is blameworthy for, and there's complete overlap between agents' portions. So the agent is responsible for the entire group action or group harm. The overlap and full scope principles both imply vicarious responsibility, so each is blameworthy for at least part of what others cause. And in the paper, we focus particularly on a justification, or on Christopher KUTZ's well-known defense of the full scope principle. So KUTZ's argument or idea centers on complicity. One is complicit when you are involved in morally wrongful activity with or of others. KUTZ proposes the complicity principle, and this seems largely equivalent to our full scope principle. I am accountable for what others do when I intentionally participate in the wrong they do or the harm they cause. I am accountable for the wrong or wrong we do, for the harm or wrong we do together, independently of the actual difference I make. So according to KUTZ, when individuals intentionally participate in wrong or harm, they each intentionally do their part of what they conceive as a collective project. And these conceptions of the project must sufficiently overlap. And when I act alone, according to KUTZ, I am the exclusive author of that action and the events caused by it. So exclusive authorship involves a causal relation between my intention and the outcome. But when I and others act collectively, I am what KUTZ calls an inclusive author of the group's actions, because I am among those who can truly say that we did it. So the causal relation between my intention and the outcome doesn't matter. What matters is the teleological relation. I aim at the collective outcome, even if I do not cause it. We can ascribe such outcomes to both the group. In our typology, this would produce in the background collective or corporate blameworthiness, but here we want to focus on what this means for the members, namely producing shared or distributed blameworthiness. Now, KUTZ places two caveats to the complicity principle. First, member actions that are outside any plausible refinement of the shared goal cannot be ascribed to the group or other members. And two, the same holds for unintended consequences that flow from behavior beyond the pale of any reasonable collective expectation. In our view, luck shows something important about the appropriateness of allocative principles. Although KUTZ does not really discuss luck, we think that the complicity principle implies that luck plays an important role in agents' accountability. From my position, for example, it is a matter of circumstantial luck that you also aimed at the collective end, and that you did so with your particular dispositions. So, for example, you might be very reckless. Yet KUTZ's justification or defense of the complicity principle curiously eschews any role for luck. So here's the justification. We are properly held accountable for the actions of groups and of individual group members in which we participate, because these actions represent our own conception of our agency and our projects. This conception embedded in our participatory action is thoroughly normative. It expresses what we desire, what we will tolerate, and what we believe. If a set of agents' participatory intentions overlap, then the will of each is represented in what each other does qua group member, as well as what they do together. The logical overlap permits us to say that they manifest their attitudes through one another's action. So what we can see here is that KUTZ justifies what seems to be a luck-imbued full scope principle via a non-luck and agency-based justification. And we think this produces a tension in his view, and we think this produces at least 3 problems for his account. The first problem we might call the problem of distortion. So if my blameworthiness is to be grounded in what I desire, tolerate, believe, accept, and so on, then surely for the full scope principle to apply, meaning that I'm responsible for the entire collective action, my attitudes must be fully in sync with the general attitude of the group. Otherwise, the group goal does not really fully represent my agency. But what are the chances that any member's desires, tolerances, and so on match perfectly with those of any other member? KUTZ says that the attitudes of the members must be sufficiently similar. But mere sufficiency of similarity, in our view, threatens to undermine the connection between my blameworthiness and my agency, which of course is what something KUTZ insists upon. So we think that such an extreme principle as the full scope principle, where you're responsible for the entire group harm, should apply only when the general attitude of the group is no distortion of each agent's mental states. And this can be only so when the group has strong interconnectedness, as we will explain. Second, for KUTZ, my blameworthiness is independent of the difference I make. My intention is what matters, but although KUTZ cares a lot about my agency, there's more to my agency than just my intentions. There's also the means I take to pursue those intentions. So for example, suppose I have a participatory intention to participate in a mob's looting of the street. And in one case, I am a bit shy and I just join with other looters and I steal from shops that are already broken into. But in another scenario, I run down the street before anyone else. I am inciting everyone by yelling that the street is ripe for looting. And in that sense, I'm much more causally efficacious. I encourage other people to their contributions. But yet, according to KUTZ, each agent would have the same scope of blameworthiness in each case. And we think this is a bit implausible in certain cases. The third problem concerns common knowledge. So for KUTZ, a person has the same scope regardless of their knowledge about the other participants. Suppose 3 siblings intend to protect their younger sibling from the local bully. 2 siblings take reasonable steps to reproach the bully verbally. However, the oldest sibling ends up beating up the bully. The 2 other siblings did not know or expect this would happen, nor did they knew that their sibling was capable of this. But beating up a bully is a plausible refinement of protecting one sibling, and it's certainly a foreseeable outcome in KUTZ's view. It's just not one that the other 2 siblings would endorse. It's even possible the other 2 siblings had no idea that their oldest sibling would get involved. Yet KUTZ claims that when we act together, the scope, or that in this case, the scope of each would be the same. although arguably the degree of them would not be. So KUTZ tries to justify this by saying that when we act together, we must expect that the group act may have certain moral agency costs. These are aspects we do not know about, but with which we will have to reckon. However, a lack of knowledge concerning others' dispositions and actions allows for circumstantial luck to play too big of a role in what agents have to reckon with. And again, we think that this creates a tension with KUTZ's agency-based justification for the full scope principle. Now, to be clear, luck sometimes rightly affects the scope of agents. We agree with this. We simply suggest that KUTZ pushes it a bit too far with his widespread application of the full scope principle. And we think that a more nuanced way of allocating blameworthiness is appropriate. So these three objections relate to three factors that we think are relevant for determining the interconnectedness within a group, namely shared intentionality, interpersonal influence, and common knowledge. So overall, our proposal is this. The stronger the interconnectedness between agents, their shared intentionality, interpersonal influence, and common knowledge over group harm, the more each is responsible for the other's contribution as well as their own, such that each has a larger scope and there's more overlap between their scopes. So if there's no interconnectedness, the portion principle applies. In group harm cases with some but not maximal interconnectedness, we think the overlap principle applies. And the more interconnected there is, the larger the individual portions will be. And only in the maximum case where the scope factor, so if each scope factor is maximally present, meaning there's maximal interconnectedness within the group, do we think that the full scope principle should apply, because only then is the group action an exact reflection of my agency. So these three factors, shared intentionality, interpersonal influence, and common knowledge, we think these are central factors for interconnectedness, but we don't want to exclude other potential factors. But we think these are important. Each factor, of course, comes in degrees or in layers, and they produce vicarious blameworthiness for each agent to the degree that they're present. Now, we think that circumstantial and resultant luck play a role in determining the extent of each factor, but none of the factors can exist without each agent exercising some agency, and individuals do have some control over the extent of each factor. So let's start with the first scope factor, shared intentionality. Here we largely follow Tuomala's categorization of collective action. According to Tuomala, the strongest sense of acting together is we-mode joint action, which involves members acting for group reasons rather than private reasons. In such cases, there is a joint intention, which is an intention ascribed to the individuals collectively, and consisting of interdependent we-mode, we-intentions of members. And so a we-mode or a we-intention is a member's intention to participate in the group members doing X together. So for example, committing a murder, and to do his part of X as his part of the murder. The we-mode implies thinking and acting as a group member, that is, from the group's perspective. In Tuomala's view, we-mode joint action is uniquely able to satisfy three unity-creating criteria. An ideal we-moder thinks and acts only for authoritative, group-centered, uniformly motivating reasons, regardless of whether they conflict with individual motives. A we-mode we-intention is only satisfied when it's satisfied for all members, because each member intends to participate in the members doing X together. So it's really important to do it as a group. And three, members are collectively committed to the satisfaction of the group's ethos and performing their parts. So these three features serve to unify the group around its ethos, which are its constitutive goals, interests, values, beliefs, practices, and norms. Now, plausibly, sharedness of intentions comes in degrees. The more fully agents approximate strongly shared intentions in Tuomala's we-mode joint action sense, the more each will be blameworthy for the other's contribution. We think this is the case because this means that each person's agency is more reflected in and is more a reflection of the other's agency. And of course, others' intentions are partly a matter of circumstantial luck, but when I adopt the we-mode, I embrace this luck fully in determining what I'm going to do and thereby, in a sense, the scope of my blameworthiness. So we think that this suggests minimally that the overlap principle applies, and possibly, depending on the other factors, the full scope principle applies. Now I will skip the part on shared action in light of time, and so move to some weaker cases. So we have mutual behavioral dependence. These are collective actions that consist of individual actions performed for a shared mutually believed reason. And this may involve a shared divided goal and I mode intentions, which roughly are equivalent to KUTZ's participatory intentions. Or it may involve strategic actions where agents respond optimally to other agents based on a mutual dependence belief. So for example, stockbrokers speculating for profit. The weakest category is commonality. Here agents simply have the same shared undivided goal. So for example, consider car drivers. Members of this group prefer to get around by car, but the aggregation of such individual actions may have major harmful consequences, for example, air pollution. Now, the agents are aware that others act similarly, and the shared mutually believed reason is known to imply a lack of concern for the environment. In such cases, we think that because the agents act for the same broad reason, their agency is partly reflected in each other's actions, but only partly and only broadly. So at best, we think that the overlap principle is appropriate, pending discussion of the other two factors. But we don't think that the full scope principle would be appropriate, as KUTZ seems to suggest. Right, let's turn to influence. We think that interpersonal influence is also an important factor in the interconnectedness. So suppose I want my competitor dead, I persuade you to help me. Here I have influenced your contribution to the outcome. Yet that contribution is also your own. And so both you and I are blameworthy for your contribution. And so the overlap principle applies. And by contrast, suppose I did not wield any influence over you, I did not even try, yet you performed your half of the murder. In that case, your contribution should not be included in my scope, unless perhaps we have shared intentions or common knowledge. Now, in cases where that influence is interpersonal, and it's exercised, then we think that both agents are blameworthy for the second agent's contribution. Now, this brings in some luck, because the first agent faces resultant luck in whether the second agent is influenceable, and the second agent first faces circumstantial luck in whether the first agent tries to exert that influence. But each agent has some agency or control of the influence, so we think that the overlap principle is appropriate. Influence can be symmetric or asymmetric. So consider, for example, riot leaders. Their scope of blameworthiness is larger than that of mere passive members because they exercise more influence. But influence can run also in both directions, meaning it's perfectly symmetrical. For example, you and I might equally influence each other to continue in our murderous scheme. And this would give us equal responsibility over each other's actions. Importantly, influence also includes counterfactuals. If I could, reasonably speaking, have influenced someone not to perform their behavior that contributes to harm, but I do not exercise that influence, then his actions are in my scope as well. In this way, a particularly influential person their scope may include quite a large chunk of the collective action. But in light of time, I will skip over common knowledge, but the idea is that this is a kind of meta factor that concerns both shared intentions and interpersonal influence. Let's turn to the final question: how does scope influence the degree? So we know that interconnectedness determines the appropriate allocative principle and thereby the individual scope of blameworthiness, and that the interconnectedness of a group is determined by the three factors mentioned earlier. But these factors all have some luck involved, so it seems that luck plays a role in what exactly is within the scope of an agent's blameworthiness. But what about degree of blameworthiness? So following Zimmerman, the scope-degree distinction enables us to say that one's scope is partly a matter of luck, while one's degree is always under one's control. Now, we have proposed factors that bring an individual scope partly under her control and partly a matter of luck. So a lack of interconnectedness can lead to a smaller scope, but it does not necessarily imply a smaller degree of blameworthiness. So luck affects the scope without affecting the degree. So for example, the scope of a drunk driver who kills someone is different from a drunk driver who does not, but they are blameworthy to the same degree. Similarly, one might be blameworthy to an extremely high degree for one's contribution to a genocide, even though interconnectedness within that group is so low that one is only blameworthy for one's own contribution and not for any other agent's contribution. But here, so it's clear that scope and degree are separate. However, scope and degree are not completely separate. Contrary to our intuitions about drunk drivers, sometimes it seems that scope really must influence degree. So consider Willing Willie. Willing Willie will go along with whatever the group does, and Willie does not really have a good excuse, but he just simply wants to belong to the group. So in one case, luck will have it that Willy contributes to a wallet theft with the highest possible interconnectedness, and so the full scope principle applies. In another case, luck will have it that he contributes to a genocide with extremely low interconnectedness, and the portion principle applies. It seems bizarre to say that Willy could possibly be as blameworthy in the former case as in the latter. Even if the agent is to the fullest extent blameworthy for stealing a wallet, obviously it is not going to be the same or even approximate the blameworthiness of an agent who contributed to genocide. Now, this might seem very obvious, but it introduces an important question. On the one hand, the wallet versus genocide comparison demonstrates that the overall group harm must somehow affect the degree of blameworthiness. On the other hand, if we want to remove luck from degree, the overall group harm might be included in an individual scope, but it should never affect an individual's degree, because the overall group harm is partly a matter of circumstantial and resultant luck. Both claims seem correct, and so the question is, how can scope both affect and not affect our degree of blameworthiness? Our answer is that the scope determines the range of degrees. In group cases, the overall group harm determines the upper and lower limits of an individual's possible degree of blameworthiness. But it's only facts about his agency that will determine where he sits within that range. Of course, it's very hard to quantify varying degrees of blameworthiness, and the following values are pure concoctions. But suppose that two agents produce a wallet theft, and the possible degree of blameworthiness ranges from 1 to, say, 20. And in a genocide case, the possible degree of blameworthiness ranges from 2 to 3,000. The degree within that particular range is determined by factors under the agent control. The degree is not determined by interconnectedness. Recall that interconnectedness determines scope, not degree. And after all, interconnectedness is partly a matter of luck. So the ranges of degrees also explain how two agents can have different scopes due to luck, and yet can be responsible to the same degree. So there's an overlap in the ranges of degree that correlate to each agent's group harm. So this is our explanation of how this is not really a problematic case of luck involving or influencing the degree. So we can conclude. So which allocative principle depends, which allocative principle applies depends on the level of interconnectedness of the group, and thereby also, of course, the agent's scope of blameworthiness. And so this means that luck plays an important role for the justification of the allocative principles, because it determines the interconnectedness with other agents that contribute to the outcome. And so luck enters in determining an agent's blameworthiness for group harms in two places. First, interconnectedness, and in this way luck affects the scope, though not to the extent we think that KUTZ allows for. And second, luck partly determines the lower and upper bounds of the range of degrees of blameworthiness the individual might have. Luck has this effect because these boundaries are determined by the overall group outcome, which partly depends on other people and is thus a matter of luck. After all, depending on which principle applies, what I'm responsible for is what we did together, or my contribution to it and your contribution to it. However, luck does not fully determine where an agent falls within the range of degrees of blameworthiness, so we think it's unproblematic. The agent controls whether they sit at the bottom, middle, top, or top of that range, and luck does not entirely determine the agent's scope of blameworthiness, even because some aspects of interconnectedness are within an agent's control. Right, thank you for watching, and I look forward to the discussion.